Hi, everyone. All right. Well, today we're going to get started on our discussion of nanostructures. These are devices or materials where one or more dimensions of the material are on the length scale of nanometers, okay? And where the dimensions are so small that quantum effects are important. Today, we're going to focus on two-dimensional materials called quantum wells. I'd like to talk about how these thin film structures are fabricated. And then we'll talk about the physics of quantum wells, the electron energy levels, what they look like, and even the kind of optical transitions that can occur within a nanostructure, a two-dimensional nanostructure. Well, here, let's go ahead and get started. So once again, our program is to study nanostructures. We're going to end up talking about quantum wells, quantum wires, which are one-dimensional nanostructures, and quantum dots. And then at the end, we'll talk about applications of these things, okay? So that's our program. And today we're going to focus on quantum wells and talk about how they're fabricated, energy levels in these systems, and optical transitions. Hang on one moment. There we go. So just to remember, up till now, we've been talking about bulk materials, usually three-dimensional bulk materials. But now we're going to talk about two-dimensional materials called quantum wells, or one-dimensional materials called quantum wires, and eventually zero-dimensional materials, fully confined materials called quantum dots. But today, the emphasis is on quantum wells, all right? So quantum wells are thin films, usually. They're usually a thin film of one material that's grown on top of another material. Let's see how that could work. So thin films of materials can be made by a variety of processes. And one type of process is called physical vapor deposition. In physical vapor deposition, we simply deposit layers of material from some source, and these form a thin film on the substrate. Maybe the simplest way to imagine this is what's called evaporation. In evaporation, we have our substrate and our source inside of a bell jar in a high vacuum. Then the source is heated up until it vaporizes, and then this vapor simply goes out in all directions and coats whatever it hits. And so it coats the substrate. So this is a very straightforward way of making a thin film of one material on top of another. It's not very well controlled, though. The films that one makes are always amorphous or polycrystalline. And yeah, as I said, it's not very well controlled. A second type of physical vapor deposition is called sputtering. In sputtering, we have a target and a substrate that we wish to coat once again. But in this case, we expose the target to a plasma, okay? Say a plasma of partially ionized argon atoms. And the plasma is biased so that the argon ions hit the sputtering target where they knock off material. And then some of this material will float around and end up on the substrate. That's sputtering. Sputtering sounds very dramatic, but it turns out that it's actually a more controlled process usually than evaporation, okay? And it's very, you can sputter lots of materials, even materials that are difficult to evaporate. So sputtering. But once again, you don't have that much control, and the films that are grown are almost always amorphous or polycrystalline. Here's another one, another physical vapor deposition technique. This is called laser ablation, and the name basically says everything. In a high vacuum, we zap the surface of the target with a laser, and this pulse of energy vaporizes part of the surface, and then this ablated material goes out in all directions, and some of it coats the substrate. Here's an image of laser ablation taking place. Sounds really dramatic, right? What's interesting, though, is that laser ablation is actually the softest and gentlest of all these processes. And thermal evaporation here, that's the most destructive, the harshest, harshest process. Anyway, laser ablation. And now there's one more of these, which is going to turn out to be the most important technique for our discussion. This is called molecular beam epitaxy. And this is a very, very highly controlled type of evaporation. In molecular beam epitaxy, we have typically a set of sources, of different sources. And these sources are carefully temperature controlled, and they're equipped with shutters so that we can switch them on and off. And then the sample sits in ultra-high vacuum, and it's exposed to fluxes of atoms from these sources. And if the temperature is right and all the conditions are right, we can arrange that the atoms from the sources will go out and coat the sample, but will do so in a very ordered way, so that if the substrate is crystalline, that the new atoms will adopt the same crystal structure and will simply continue the crystal structure as we grow more and more layers. So that we can have one crystal where perhaps at some point, as we grow this layer, the composition changes from one material, say aluminum arsenide, to a second material, say gallium arsenide, and then back again. Okay? In fact, this is one of the most well-known family of materials for growing heterostructures, that's what these are called, by molecular beam epitaxy. This is what a molecular beam epitaxy system might look like. Here you see all of the different sources with the shutters in front of them. And then you see the sample here on a temperature-controlled stage. And all of this is in an ultra-high vacuum system. Okay? And now all the sources and the shutters and everything are computer-controlled. And typically there's analysis equipment so that you can monitor the crystal growth while it's taking place in situ. But when this is done right, it's really an amazing thing, because you can grow literally crystalline material where you switch from one material to a second in one atomic plane, and grow layers whose thickness is controlled to within one atomic plane, as in this structure here, where we're alternating between gallium arsenide and aluminum arsenide, okay, to make a heterostructure. So the thin films that you make here are two-dimensional materials. They're nanoscale in one dimension, and they're extended in the other two dimensions, okay? Molecular beam epitaxy is a outstanding way to grow things, but it does have some issues. And these issues keep it mainly confined to research labs. One is that it's very expensive. Here's a molecular beam epitaxy system here. And systems like this tend to cost a lot of money, on the order of $1 million. And they tend to require a dedicated technician, so that's a lot of money too. So that's one thing. But the reason that they're mainly used only in research is that films end up being grown very slowly. So it would take a long time to make a thick layer or to make a lot of material, a lot of samples in a molecular beam epitaxy machine, but they're perfect for research. For commercial purposes, CVD is the technique of choice. CVD is chemical vapor deposition. Here, the film growth doesn't take place in a vacuum, but in usually a low pressure gas environment. And we have precursors for the materials that we want to deposit. And then these decompose in a chemical reaction that results in the material being deposited on the surface. So that's all, in a way, a lot more complicated than what happens in molecular beam epitaxy. But you can grow films at a much higher rates. So often materials are discovered with molecular beam epitaxy And then if there's a commercial application, someone develops a technique for growing them by CVD. And here's a CVD system here, a small one, a research class CVD system. They're still expensive, complicated machines, but they can grow at much higher rates. Here's one more. This is called atomic layer deposition, and it's related to CVD. But like molecular beam epitaxy, it can do really atomic layer by atomic layer growth. Okay, and in atomic layer deposition, one does something like this. You have your substrate, you coat it with the first precursor whose chemical properties are such that it will grow a monolayer. But then new atoms of this material won't stick to the surface that's coated. So it grows a monolayer and then it stops. And then you introduce the next chemical, which reacts with this to grow another monolayer, but then crystal growth stops again. Okay? And then we have a process where a third layer grows, and so on. So the chemistry is more complicated, but some advantages of this is that this is done at sort of ordinary pressures, not ultra high vacuum. And what's more, the substrates don't have to be flat, they can be curved. The molecules will coat any shaped surface. So atomic layer deposition is another way of growing thin two-dimensional films. Okay. Finally, I want to mention one more. Okay. A very high quality two-dimensional material called graphene was produced in the following way. So graphene is made by cleaving crystals of graphite. And you may remember in crystals of graphite, we have these kind of honeycomb layers of carbon atoms that are covalently bonded to each other in sheets. So we have sp3 hybrid orbital bonding, covalent bonding in the sheets, but the sheets are only bounded one to another in graphite by weak van der Waals bonds. And because they're weak, one can take a piece of crystalline graphite and actually cleave it, pull it apart by the simple technique of taking a piece of tape, sticking it to the surface and peeling it off, okay? This was sort of known for a while, but then in the 2000s, Andrei Geim and Novoselov, a student of his, had the idea to really focus on this process of peeling off layers with tape and then taking two pieces of tape, sticking them together across the layer and pulling them apart to cleave the layer that they'd split off once again, and then to do this over and over again and see where they got. And where they got to were single sheets of graphene, one atom thick layers. So here's another two-dimensional material that's made not with a fancy machine, but with Scotch tape. And we've done this in our lab too, and it works pretty well. But one thing about this is that the pieces of graphene that one gets are always very small. This is actually a champion piece that's 10 microns across in one dimension. You'd have to work on this for a long time before you get a piece that big. Most of them are like 1 micron across. You can only see them in an electron microscope. Since this discovery, people have figured out other ways of making graphene. And one way is by chemical vapor deposition, where methane is decomposed above a hot substrate, and the carbon atoms go to form graphene, and the hydrogen is released. And in that way, one can coat, basically coat wafers with graphene. The graphene that's made in this way is very nice in that one can grow large area surfaces, but it turns out the quality is not quite as good as these perfect layers that are split from a crystal of graphite. Okay? Great. Let's stop here. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble. There we are.